Hey everybody, welcome back to Nidus Anarchy Series. I'm your host Adam, CIO and co-founder of Nidus, and today I have Joe Andrew from Legendary Requirements, and we're going to be talking about decentralized identity and probably a bunch of other stuff. Probably something about requirements. I don't know. We'll find out what that is. But Joe Andrew, nice to meet you. Thank you for coming on and speaking with us.
Nice to meet you, Adam.
Um,
Glad I could be here.
and I know you're out in California, and it's kind of time zone difference, but I don't think it's that big of a deal right now. We're all kind
No,
of
not
relaxed
too
today.
bad. Middle of the day.
Yeah. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your background? Like, how did you get into, I guess, just identity management as a whole? And then we
Sure.
can kind of go into like the decentralized stuff in a little bit.
Sure. I got into identity management because I had a startup in maybe 2016 that had a radically different take on identity. It was a search organizer, kind of like Evernote combined with
Mhm.
AdWords. So
Okay.
as you search the web and kept track of this complicated search, like you're buying a home or you found out your kid has leukemia or whatever, you're gonna do a lot of
That's a,
searches. It's not one query, right? I mean, you can put
right.
yourself in that place and say, yeah, I'm going to do a lot of searches to try and understand my options, to get second opinions.
Yep.
The most high value search products or search is aren't a single query. It's not about a single query. It's about some
Right.
life transformation you're going through. So we had a tool that helped with that.
Hmm.
And I presented to Doc Searles, hey, I've this idea. It actually solves your problem. Where his wife had asked him once, how come I can't take my shopping cart from one website to another?
Hmm.
And what we were doing was, in effect, having that kind of cross-site gathering of what's important to you. And so I was
Okay.
like, hey, Doc, we could actually do a cross-site shopping cart. And he was like, you need to come to IIW. And so I showed up and I realized, what people were talking about identity in that conversation was different and interesting, but related. Like there was a lot of work, with the sort of surveillance capitalism architecture where
Mhm.
we try to infer by what you're looking at something about your intended behavior. Like an auto intender is a classification you might get on these ad networks. And if they
Mhm.
think you're about to buy a car, you'll get tagged that way. And then they will show you car ads. And there's a whole complicated industry to try to figure that out. And our whole approach was, why don't we just have the user like organize what they're looking at? And then
Right.
that artifact tells us more than how old you are or what your demographics are, how much
Yeah.
money you make, etc. So just my sense of what was important in the web experience was completely separated from the traditional notions of identity. And I'm like, oh, maybe this other way to think about people is a more useful way to engage with identity. And that began a decade and a half relationship at IIW. And that company has since gone and passed. I mean, it's,
Okay.
I've been through several different, cat's lives, if you will. Um, and I ended up getting involved with the verifiable credentials working group at the W3C, in part because of conversations at IAW, which led to conversations at ID 2020.
Mhm.
And then I went to it happened to be the second Rebooting the Web of Trust, which is a collaborative writing workshop around decentralized identity topics. And in that audience, I started working on use cases for the verifiable credentials work. And at the first rebooting, I just pulled together a couple of guys. We had an hour. It was like a choose your own adventure kind of an hour. And hey, some of us decided to talk about the verifiable credentials use case document, which was then in draft form. I just pulled some guys together. We were smart guys, technically competent. We passionate about this space, but we just spent an hour like reading the doc and giving comments and feedback. And the folks in the working group loved it, and they were like, oh, hey, can you do more of this? Like, can you help us out? Like, hey, do you want to be an editor? So that was how I got roped into this standards conversation where we were really documenting the consensus as we go, and it sort of shaped my whole idea about how I think about requirements.
Mhm.
Because when you're working on specs like this, it's really about taking working code that multiple different parties have created and finding a way to get their differences to be interoperable, right? So you should have already solved the problem, and now you're dealing with a standard so that our software can talk to each other. So
Right.
it's not like traditional waterfall requirements, where we do the requirements first, and then we do some
Yep.
analysis, then we do some design, then you do some implementation. Like that is not how standards requirements are in my experience. That's not how it happens. Companies come together with a technical idea that they've probably implemented part of or all of it, and then they're trying to get standards built around it. And
Right.
so the use case work was about documenting the consensus of how that changed. Like we'd be 3/4 of the way into the verifiable credentials working group, and someone would say, "I no, this feature is really important to me." Like blah blah blah. And they're really arguing about it. Like, well, what use case is it talking about? It's like,
Yeah.
oh, that's a good use case. We need to add it
Okay.
to the document.
Got you.
So that was how I got involved. And now we are members of the W3C. I have a small consulting firm that's focused entirely on requirements engineering and specifically for decentralized identity. So we
Wow.
have an approach that is very human centric in that we want to understand the requirements independent of the technology.
Okay.
Because if we understand that, then you can evaluate the technology better.
Right.
Like you don't
Okay.
want to start with it's got to
I
be
can't tell
XYZ.
you how many times I go into a company and they're like, okay, this is the product we have. Let's start building. And I'm like, what are the requirements? Where's the requirements in design? Where are the use cases? And like, well, we don't have that, but let's just start installing. And it's like,
Yep,
you are out of your mind. It's
that's
like,
right.
you have to start with requirements. And the more detailed you have those requirements, the better, more successful your project is going to be 100% of the time.
That's right. And so most of our team have a background in software development.
Mhm.
Spent, I don't know, 15 years, 20 years doing independent consulting, startup, technology guy. Sometimes my own startup, sometimes another team. And it was always the problem that as a developer, you were giving this underspecified set of
Yeah,
requirements and miracles are supposed to happen. And it
right.
was just constantly so frustrating that the marketing department came in with this meaningless document that told me about where this person went to second grade because that aspect of their persona mattered somehow. And I'm like, I'm writing an email app. I don't know that their second grade experiences really matter. So we're all developers, and so we have a certain sensibility about what you should actually be putting in requirements.
Yeah.
Um, and so we work with clients to figure that out. And as the really, I was the lead editor for both the VC use case document and the decentralized identifier use case document. And so having some deep expertise in those areas,
Mhm.
you know, it's been a great conversation to have with potential clients to say, hey, if you're working with DIDs or VCs, well, we can probably help. And if you're not dealing with DIDs and VCs, guess what? Maybe I can help you find someone else because that's our niche, that's our specialty. And if, you're not in that mix, it's probably not going to be worth it to hire us to
So,
work on it.
a key thing that you just said, you said DIDs or VCs, right? So decentralized IDs or verifiable credentials, right?
Mhm.
You made that's a huge statement in my mind because what you're saying is they're two separate things. In
Absolutely.
the identity world, and I agree with you, by the way,
Yeah.
in the
Good.
identity world, everyone's lumping those two together right now, and it's
Mhm.
driving me insane because they're not the same. They're very, very different.
They are. Yep. I have had several rants on Twitter against people who say, why are people with DIDs saying XYZ? And I'm like, they're not. You use verifiable credentials for what you just said that
Right.
DIDs are. And so DIDs were not meant to solve what VCs are.
Yeah.
But sometimes when you're just learning about these kind of new technologies, you try to map them.
Yeah.
And for better or worse, they were developed together. Like when we
Mhm.
developed VCs, there was an understanding that, oh, this DID thing that we're eventually going to figure out will give us the decentralized form of the identifier, but let's have
Right.
the decentralized form of a credential.
Right.
And
Your VC
so,
is like a role or an attribute of you, but your decentralized identity is irrelevant. Or not relevant. I shouldn't say irrelevant is the wrong word. It's like the root binding of all the VCs too, right?
that's right, as an identifier. So one shift I would make there, actually this was an interesting aha that came out of preparation for ID 2020
Mhm.
at an IAW session. So we knew ID 2020 was around the corner. We were just a handful of us sitting around the table saying, how can we be more effective? Like, do we have agenda items we want to cover? What are the things we want to avoid? Whatever. And one of the things that came out of that was, hey, we need to be able to talk about identity better. And one of the things that was clicked right there and very quickly was we often say identity when we mean identifier. And
Okay.
that often confuses people because they think, oh, my DID is an identity, or my social security number is an identity, or my driver's license is an identity. And the reality is a DID and a social security number are identifiers,
Correct.
and a driver's license is a credential,
Right.
which almost always has an identifier in it.
Mhm.
And through that, you can help someone establish a sense of identity. Like before this call, Adam, you and I hadn't met. You had a limited notion of who Joe Andrieu is, or otherwise I wouldn't have been invited on the show, obviously. But now you have a different, more advanced notion of who I am. You've heard my voice. You're seeing my face. Like we're getting some sense of rapport or
We're getting
camaraderie.
ready to deep fake you all day right now.
Exactly. So Adam, now has this deep sense of Joe, Andrew, that you didn't have before. And that's where identity resides. It's in the subjective recognition that, hey, this thing out there that I'm interacting with, it's the same
Mhm.
thing as I interacted with before. Oh no,
Yep.
like reputation, like, oh no, you didn't. I don't want to talk to you again because last time you punched me, or oh yeah, last time I talked to you, you were nice. Like these are identity that manifests in our pure psychology. It doesn't need a
Yep.
database, doesn't need a computer.
And I think humans are naturally wired that way because if someone's like, oh man, someone stole my identity. We just talked to like my mom or something. I think their idea of identity is pure in the sense where it's like someone is stealing like who I am as a person, not just a credential.
That's
And
right.
that's really what your identity is it's you as a person and all this other stuff that makes you up, that makes you and your identity.
Yes, I would subtly shift a tad,
Mhm.
which is one of the definitions that came out of some of this work, is identity is how we recognize, remember, and respond to
Okay.
specific people and things. And in that framing, the identity is never a concrete thing. It is a subjective thing. And
Ephemeral.
if I
Yeah.
remember anyone, if I recognize anyone, even recognizing just that that's a cop or that's a fireman, I'm using a notion of group identity to change
Mm.
how I deal with that individual. And that we do this at least as old as written language. Like identity and names are at least as old as written language. We don't know if it predates spoken language because we don't have good markers for that. But it seems to be that core to language is this idea of identifying things that you make statements about.
Mhm.
And, a pronoun is an identifier. It's just a very generic one. And Joe Andrew is an identifier. Adam Callan is an identifier. And we use these to construct our understanding of the world. And it happened before we had any computers. And even as an individual, as a child, it happens before I have any tools around me.
I would say it's animalistic. I mean, if you just look at dogs, they can
Yep,
identify other dogs by the smell.
that's right.
So there is an identity of that dog that other dogs recognize and they sniff each other's butts and figure it out. You know what I mean? It's like
That's right.
that's their verifiable credentials, their butt smell. So
That's
I
right.
think it's an animalistic behavior that we want to have our own identity and that it means something in the sense where it's our identity represents a whole bunch more than just what you see or what you hear, but it's that conglomeration of a lot of different attributes.
That's right. Doc Searles had a great anecdote about, well, it's not really an anecdote, just a way to think about it, that the dog walking into the room has a much richer sense of identity than any website we visited. Um, there is so much tacit knowledge that we use to construct identity, that when we move into the digital world where all information is explicit because it goes into bits that go
Mhm.
over the wire,
Right.
we we use all these implicit mechanisms, like that we infer things about you because your height, because your skin color, your whatever. Some of this is bad, some of this moves into stereotypes and prejudice, but some of it also, like, hey, that's an old person, I want to be kind to them, or it's a young
Right.
person, I want to give them some grace because maybe they don't understand what we're doing. Like, it's just innate in how we engage the world.
Yeah.
And it's this challenge of the tacit versus the explicit. And in the digital worlds, everything's explicit, and we aren't used to that as human beings.
True. Very true. No, that makes total sense actually, because like you're saying, like when the dog walks in, they understand the identity more than like the binary sense, and that makes total sense because it's you have something like I keep thinking of I forget if it's Meet the Fockers or whatever, but where they had
Sure.
Jinxie the cat and they lost the cat and he goes to the pound and just finds a cat, another Siamese that
Right.
looks like him,
Yep.
spray paints the tail, like ah look I found him. In the
Yep.
hero. And it's like, but even though the cat looked the same, it's the same type of cat, but it behaved a little bit differently. Therefore, they knew it wasn't that cat. And it's the
That's
same
right.
thing. It's like you can have all these quote things that are identifiers that match. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is that same identity.
That's right. There was a great talk by Jeff Jonas at the Digital Identity World, and maybe I don't remember what it was. It was the last Digital Identity World in Vegas, but he got up and he talked about space-time travel data, and it's one of my favorite ideas. But he built a very successful business, sold it to IBM, and that business did fraud detection for Las Vegas casinos. Like
Okay,
literally, we know that we have these 100 bad actors who have been caught cheating casinos. Those 100 bad actors, we need to identify if they come into our casino. Like that was the
right.
challenge. And so he had done a deep and well-funded investigation into the facial recognition of the time. Like today,
Mhm.
it's a different conversation, but what it was,
Yeah,
15 years ago. And he said, I couldn't, the technology wasn't good enough for me to do this on its own. But if I could constrain the set of actors and constrain some other information about them, then it became really valuable. And so he developed this system to sort of deal with that. And he gave this Gedanken, this thought experiment, where he said, imagine two women up on stage. They look identical. The fact is, they are twins. They are identical
hmm,
twins. Their DNA is exactly the same. They are both holding up a legitimately issued driver's license that is identical. They both driver's license say Mary Smith, but only one of them is Mary Smith. And in answering the question of how do I know which one is Mary Smith, it led to the question of what does it mean that that's Mary Smith?
hmm.
And that ended up anchoring what turned into my first rebooting paper, Rebooting the Web of Trust, which was identity fundamentally is this correlation. Like what matters really for me in that scenario, if I place myself in this and I have some relationship with Mary that I care about, I knew her in high school. What I care about is the one of the two twins is the one that I went to high school with.
Right.
Like what I want is spatial continuity in space time about how that body traveled through space time. I want it to be the same person.
Wow. Okay.
And I'm like, oh, space time travel data. And he's like,
That's
by the way,
crazy.
mobile phones are already
Oh,
capturing and using this data in ways that you
definitely.
don't know. And here's all the ways I'm going to tell you about how scary that is. And they can find out who your friends are, where you hang out after work, where you work,
Yeah.
who you're having the affair with, which motel you go to for it. Like having that space-time travel data just
Oddly
opens up.
specific, but okay. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, a little salacious
Yeah.
sometimes will help with the ratings. Um, but it was a really powerful idea that is one notion of identity. And that my first paper happened to be about that. And then I realized a couple of years later, through more and more conversations, there are at least 5 mental models that people have for identity that we would show up at IAW or rebooting or what have you, and we would be talking past each other because one person would say identity meaning this way and someone else would say it meaning another way. And sometimes it worked and it didn't matter. Sometimes it was like, that guy's crazy. Like, why is he saying that? That's just not true. And then you argue about what's true when really you had different notions. And those, I don't know if I'll remember all 5 off the top of my head, but one of is this space-time travel data, like that you are that person. And this
Interesting.
matters mostly to like enforcement. Like even the libertarians or the people who don't want, state surveillance to catch all the bad guys, we don't want the wrong guy to be put in jail.
Correct.
Like at that point, space-time travel data of your identity, like we want the person whose hand held the knife that caused the crime. We want that person to go to jail.
So it's almost like an identity provenance.
That's right. That is identity as provenance in that context for
Interesting.
sure. Another way that many people talk about this, especially in sort of the Project VRM or the more libertarian-minded part of this community, where it's really about the user centricity, is that identity is how you represent yourself to society.
Mhm.
And whether you're gay or Republican or a gay Republican, that's your business about whether or
Yeah.
not you present yourself as that. And I strongly believe in a free society, it's really important to be able to have some control over that. And
Right.
what's important then is how I show up in society, not necessarily, that I'm connected via the space-time travel data. Like, and the people who are worried about security or worried about putting the right people in jail, they're often like, no, you don't get to decide that you're not a criminal. You don't get to represent your identity and say, no,
Yeah.
I'm innocent. Well, actually, you do get to represent that. It's just that other people don't have to believe it.
Yeah.
Um, but we ended up modeling out 5 different mental models that people would use that are really fundamentally different. Like this representation idea, it's very, very different than the space-time travel data. So that's part of why this identity stuff is so hard, because we implicitly swim in a world of identity and we don't think about how we transition between our own personas when we deal with different people. We just do it. And
Well,
when a bad actor's there and we are uncomfortable, we got a little green knot, we're like, I don't know if I want to leave that guy with my daughter. Like all that happens
yeah.
without explicit processing.
Yeah, that's your lizard brain. kicking in.
That's right.
So it's interesting this too, because this is a big reason I'm a huge fan. I'm a security nerd, right? I'm old school hacker since I was a kid, so it's always been about privacy and leave me alone and away from big
Uh-huh.
government and all this kind of stuff. So when decentralized identity came out as a thing, I really latched on in the Web3 space. So we do a
Uh-huh.
lot of blockchain development, smart contract work, decentralized application development, stuff like that. So Web3 wallets was my first real, like, no, we're using it every day. Like, I use decentralized identity every day for tons of applications. It works flawlessly.
Yep.
And then when you go to the enterprise, you're like, check this out. And they're like, ooh, we don't know if that's going to work. It's like, it's protecting almost $2 trillion worth of funds.
That's
It
right.
works, I promise. It's like, you're just slow. It's okay. But one thing I like about it too, like what you were just talking about, was the identity up through this time and space is when you're giving up information, like, okay, well, the Republican, gay Republican, or your dog, whatever, it's like you only want to divulge what you need to at a bare minimum at that particular time for that particular resource that's requesting it because you
That's
have
right.
to for whatever reason. And it's like myself, like I have multiple identities in that sense, and I've kept it very, over the years, I've been keeping them separate. Like I run an IT security identity management company. I also have a tattoo shop in Puerto Rico.
Oh, nice.
Those two worlds have nothing to do with each other. The people have nothing to do with each other. So it's like I'm tattooed Adam when I'm down in Puerto Rico hanging out with my guys there, and then I'm
Nice.
identity security guy when I'm at Identifiers. So it's
Uh,
like, and no, those two people just don't match, and I talk differently. I say different things because, like, if I were to talk to my tattoo guy, it's the same way we're having a conversation. It's just gonna be deer in headlights. I'll have no idea what
that's
we're
right.
talking about. And a lot of times, not as much now. Obviously, times have changed, but when I was younger, showing up with like visible tattoos into like a boardroom with the chairman of a bank, and they're like,
Oh, yeah.
going on here? It's like, well, it would be sometimes nice to be like, I don't want to divulge that information to you because it's irrelevant for the conversation that we're having.
That's right. Yeah, I think it's especially true in hiring. Like, there are all sorts of mechanisms of, uh, I haven't seen any good implementation in practice, but this whole world of smart resumes and selective disclosure over your transcripts and things of
Mhm.
that nature means that we could imagine actually a process where you are verifiably prove that you graduated from, say, one of the top 100 uh, colleges in the US or
Right.
in the world without divulging which school.
Right.
Like, that is weirdly possible. Like, it's
Zero
hard. You have
knowledge
to jump through
proofs.
some hoops. But,
Yeah.
the fact that someone went to a historically black college could be used to filter them out at a company that
Right.
doesn't want to hire black people because it's mostly black people who go to historically black colleges.
Yeah.
And so we have an opportunity through selective disclosure to have earlier in the process be more fair. Now,
Right.
ultimately, when you're actually meeting someone in the flesh, all the biases are going to be evident and present.
But
But
you, as a person, can react, cater, and counter those thoughts as they pop into their heads, right? Because I mean, I get that. Like,
that's
I'll
right.
show up to someone and they'll see me. I'm 7 foot tall. I'm visibly tattooed. I am a very outspoken, blunt person. I'm from New York City, right? So it's like I have that very much attitude. So when I'm talking to people, I'll see their reactions right away in person, and they'll judge me immediately. But then all of a
Yep.
sudden, once we start talking, you can see the judgments changing. Where on
That's
a
right.
piece of paper, you can't. They're going to form their opinion, and then it becomes more solidified throughout time.
Yep. Or you just dismissed. I mean, that's part of the
Right.
problem with, these big funnels, whether it's a candidate or a sales pipeline. Like, you got to start with 10,000 people, to
Yeah.
get to ultimately 10 proposals that two people buy. Like, whatever the ratio is,
Right.
you need to get more numbers in there to get to the kind of social equity that I think some of us would like to see. I don't want to see us pay a huge price for it, but I think it's important to work on that stuff.
Yeah, I think the best way, because I mean, DE&I is a big thing everywhere right now, right? Like every company, big company is promoting it and forcing it sometimes, which I think is the opposite direction of what you should be doing.
Yep.
What you're talking about now really allows for that to happen in a natural progressive way, which is, okay, if you can remove all the biases and you can deliver only the necessary facts and you have it in a streamlined form, then you really have a much more even playing field for everything to naturally occur. And then it kind of removes the bias in a sense if you can make it where it's like a zero knowledge proof of these things, like which college did you go to? Well, I can prove that I went to college. I can prove that I got a certain GPA and
That's
it's
right.
verified. I can show you that I've worked at this company and I had this role verified. Like, I'm not going to give you their name because they want to remain private. I did security stuff for them. but
Right.
it was a Fortune 50 company verified. So you can have all this verifiable information, like, oh, this is all legit, and you don't have to question it, which is the best part. Because how many resumes do you get where you're looking at it and then you talk to the guy and you're like, you didn't do any of this. It's like,
Yeah.
it's like, or it's like, I've seen this resume before, and now I'm talking to two different people. It's like this type of stuff is huge right now, especially in the identity management space. It's from a contractor's perspective, there's a
Yeah.
ton of people use. I've actually had a company hit me up saying, "Hey, we wanted to talk to you only because we received your resume and it was with a different name on it."
Wow.
And I
I
was
haven't gotten
like,
that call, but
"What?" And
yeah,
I'm like,
that's
"Are you
surprising.
kidding me?" And they're like, "Yeah." And we talked to them, and they obviously didn't do the thing. So we're curious. What did you do at healthcare.gov? And then when they found out I was actually the real guy, they're like, and I was like, that's insane. And then after speaking to a couple of recruiters and straight up asking them, yeah, apparently that's a problem. People just swapping names on a resume and submitting it.
Yeah, that's madness.
But with verifiable credentials, that all goes away.
Yeah, it becomes a lot harder. I mean, I think
Yeah.
one of the interesting things that, well, I don't know, do I want to go in that direction? Uh, the I think the really interesting stuff that is on my horizon in terms of where I'm excited about what's going on with this technology is the leverage that we're seeing in the U.S. government and
Yeah.
its adoption and its advocacy of both DIDs and verifiable credentials. And I'll credit Neil John over at DHS. He's been doing some really interesting work and putting government money into projects through grant proposals and other mechanisms. And he's really done quite a bit to help, like, put the money where the mouth is.
Mhm.
Like that was part of his conversation. Like, okay, you've been talking about this stuff for a while. Well, put up or shut up. Here's some money, and that has led to deployments that and well, I don't know if there are deployments yet in federal systems, but certainly proofs of concept with different parts of the U.S. federal government trying to explore, like, if it's Customs and Border Protection, like how
Mhm.
might we use VCs to deal with imported goods? That's an
Right.
important question. And when the U.S. government starts turning on to adopt these technologies, then we start to get a standard that more people can use with a lower marginal cost. So when we start to see that the way you interact with the U.S. government is using VCs, well, then those W3C VC conformant wallets will become more valuable, and you start to get a nice virtual cycle,
Right.
because right now there's so many different wallets, and
Right.
they're rarely compatible. Like, I remember at a Cosmoverse a couple of years ago, one of the guys from one of the sort of NFT wallets was like, yeah, I've got 17 NFT standards and there are more coming down the pike. I don't want to support all these different ways that I have to figure out to represent these NFTs
Yeah.
that my
Oh,
customers
now you got
bought.
ordinals. Have fun.
Right. And now you have ordinals or runes, right? Which was just this last week, right, at
Yep.
the happening. Um, so it's it's a lot of work to get any sort of shared standard. And so the fact that the US government is backing some version of these, I think, is a really big win for getting to the scale where you, because really, I think on the other side of this, Adam, you and I don't want to have to think about a wallet. We just want to
No.
use the wallet
Right.
so that we can have different social interactions. So I kind of want the wallet wars to be over. Um,
Yes.
and I'm, as a company, I'm not banking on my wallet anywhere. I'm banking on the fact that at the end of the day, I do believe we are going to have these cryptographic capabilities that most consumers are going to have, in the same way that we expect in the Western world that most consumers have access to a car.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean everyone has a car, but you can get a car, and if you want to build a business around cars, you can do that, whether it's Domino's or it's a fast food joint with a drive-through. Like, cars become an option, and I think we will get there, if we're not there already, with regard to hardware wallets, self-custody wallets, whatever. And when we're in that world where now the average person, we can expect that they have cryptographic secrets that they can
Yeah.
verify interactions with in a remote context, that's huge. It changes how
Oh,
we can organize all of our information technology. But there's a catch 22 that if nobody has wallets, you can't do it.
right.
And then when everyone has it, you have to have already figured it out. Like, so how do we get from the part where some people have wallets to where it's ubiquitous? And frankly, that's the biggest reason I'm a fan of NFTs.
Okay.
Not because I had an altcoin or anything, or made a lot of money off some, cats or apes or whatever. Um, but they did drive adoption and social awareness of this
Oh yeah.
architectural pattern of having a piece of software or a device that has secrets. And because of that, you can interact in a more reliable way, more trustworthy way.
Yep.
That's our future. And I think
Oh, big
I don't
time.
really care who wins the wallet war. I just want that future to be there so I can help build new social institutions based off it.
Yep. And for people that are not super technically sound, like if you really want to take it back to original wallet, like where's my wallet? I don't even know. I don't know. I have a wallet somewhere.
The
Who
old
cares?
school
But
wallet.
yeah, I'm like, oh shit, I just lost my wallet. But like wallets, like old school in your hand wallet works the same way. It's a wallet that holds your different, sometimes verifiable credentials, like a driver's license, and it may hold digital assets like a credit card or a debit card that holds to your money for paying for things. But every credit card is the same dimension. Your driver's license are the same dimensions across all states.
That's right. So
So
it's
when you
easy.
this way, it's this that's your standard, right? So this way it always fits. So
That's
you can
right.
buy a wallet from Walmart, you could buy a wallet from Gucci, but they're all going to work with your verifiable credentials and with your decentralized IDs the same way because they all fit and they all interact. Like, oh, I have a credit card. Well, they all use a magstripe. Everyone knows how to use a magstripe because it's a standard.
Yeah,
So in a
exactly right.
digital wallet sense, we want the same thing. Like we don't care, like you're just saying, I don't really care what wallet's out there. What I don't want is someone saying you have to use my wallet for all this stuff to work.
That's
That
right.
completely eliminates the word decentralized, which is the first
Yep.
D in dead.
Yep. And it takes us right back to AOL, right? Like the walled garden approach of the late 90s, the web won because it was decentralized.
Yeah,
Now, the identifier architecture isn't, but the actual operations of the web are as decentralized as you could ask for. Um, and so let's do that again. Like email
yeah,
was decentralized, the web, online services like the web got decentralized. Now let's move it to identifiers, and that will let us move a little bit more further down. And so instead of having an AOL that is, taking a huge portion of the marketplace and it gets to define the market, let's get to a World Wide Web where we literally have an uncountable number of websites we don't even know exist because they're on private contexts or
right.
whatever. Like that's the world eventually we will get to, because identity and reality are not centralized. We
Mhm.
are literally, physics itself is locally organized. Like all we know is that two atoms are so relationship to each other. The idea that there is a Cartesian physical space that's empty in which things exist, that's just not true. Like it was a convenient idea for thinking, like Newton used it, like we've used it in algebra and calculus, and like, oh, if we think about space in this way, it's very convenient to do some math with it. But the reality is time travels differently the further you are away from the center of the earth because of gravitational acceleration. So
Right.
time isn't even consistent. Like, a very small unit of distance, like going up 100 feet, you
Yep.
can measure that different. Well, I don't know if we can measure that little of a difference, but certainly if you go up 1,000 feet, you get into an airplane, you can start to measure with today's technology the difference in temporality. And
Yeah.
so it's just very clear the world is not centralized. The
Yep.
attempts to centralize really are to serve a business function or a political function. And I appreciate those functions. Like the Social Security Administration is a great social movement, but I don't need to use that centralized Social
That I
Security
can't
number
change.
for all my credit checks,
Yeah.
right? Every credit card I get gets tied to it. Every bank account gets tied to it. It's like it wasn't meant to be used that way, but it
Yeah.
was convenient to do so. And so part of what I see the decentralized identity movement is doing is restoring the naturally decentralized nature of identity so that we don't have a mismatch between how our minds, our biological minds that have evolved to think about the world in a particular way, that's not disjoint from how we build our technical systems. Because then I
Yep.
think we have less of a mismatch, more alignment. There's just less accidental sort of frustration and harms.
True. I'm sure you're aware, the EU is drastically farther ahead of us when it comes to decentralized self-sovereign IDs, mainly because of regulation, right? Regulation kind of funds business growth in that sense. Now, what do you think about passkeys versus decentralized IDs, or do you see some weird world where they all are married and used together?
So define what you mean by passkey there.
So right now, I would say because Apple came out with the passkey for the phone and on the Mac and everything, some people are finally talking about passkeys, where a individual public-private key is generated per site per use. So therefore, you store your private key, you do the signing. There is no more username password authentication. It's authentication via passkey. So right
Yep.
now, a lot of the U.S. identity experts are saying passkeys are the future. Everything's going passkey, and I feel like you're just saying everything's going public-private key pair. We've
That's
been
right.
doing that for about 40 years. So I'm
Yeah,
not
that
sure, like
yeah,
passkey
I
is
think
our answer.
I agree with you. Like I think passkeys are sort of, well, let's use public keys.
Yeah,
And we explored that in a pretty robust way with pretty good privacy.
right.
And that was a long time ago. And a lot of people tried to like bake it in your email. I mean, there was a lot of effort to try
Yeah.
and solve the problem that way. And the problem was key rotation.
Yep.
And what was robust and rigorous with PGP became unrigorous when PGP key servers were invented. And
Hmm.
so you started having key servers as a point of error and as a point of centralization. And like I was not part of that movement, but
Hmm.
looking back, that seems to be part of why it failed. And so what DIDs are trying to do, and they were very much inspired by PGP. This is why
Sure.
rebooting the Web of Trust is called the Web of Trust. It was because of the Web of Trust that PGP was trying to invent, and
Hmm.
we're trying to reboot it because now that we have things like Bitcoin or Ethereum, and you have these distributed ledgers, we now have another way to have a public store where you might maintain identifier state, and that sort of changes everything. What you get with a DID that you don't have with public and private keys is you have a level of indirection between the identifier and the cryptographic material that's bound to it.
Hmm.
So if I have a DID, for example, on Bitcoin, then I'm going to interpret the state of Bitcoin to figure out what are the public keys that I should use for this particular identifier today. And by going through posting a Bitcoin transaction, I can rotate those keys and bind a
Hmm.
different public key so that tomorrow I'm authenticating with a different public key. And so we didn't have, before you had that
Hmm.
decentralized substrate, I would have to tell everyone who was using my public key that, hey, I have a new public key. Now I
Right.
could sign it with the old one and I could do this sort of rotation manually, but how do I know who has my ID, especially if it was published like on a
So could we
newspaper or
use
at a presentation?
ENS in a similar way?
I'm sorry?
Could we use ENS, an Ethereum naming service, in a similar way, like .eth addresses?
Um,
Because that allows us to
the
change the underlying public address that's tied to something that you disseminate. Like on my business cards, I have adum.eth.
yes.
I hand it out to everybody, but I can and it's more than just one wallet. Like you can point it, and you can even create subdomains, which is I just learned, which is bizarre. So I could have like pay.adum.eth.
So there is in fact a DID based on ENS,
Okay.
which I found. I'll plug our favorite little service we put together, the diddirectory.com, which is the
Oh
easiest way
wow,
to find out about any DID method.
that's awesome.
Um, all it really is a user-friendly version of what's published at the W3C. We literally
Okay.
just pull that Git repo, and
Yeah.
then we have a database in front of it, so you can do a search and whatnot. So did ENS exists? Veramo put it together.
Oh,
Veramo.
nice.
That was Oliver Turbu's work. I don't know if you know Oliver. Used to
Mhm.
be at Consensus. Now he's at Spruce ID.
Okay.
Um, so yes, there are ways, and people have also looked into uh, how can you use IPNS
Mhm.
to do a DID, right? IPFS you can't
IP.
because the
Yeah.
the, the root of
The pinning
IPFS, if
rules,
you
right? Yeah.
change the DID document, the address changes. But with
Yeah.
IPNS, you have a way to secure a history of documents that you could
Right.
then link to a stable identifier over time. So
Okay.
one of the ways that I think about these DIDs is that architecturally, they take any decentralized system
Hmm.
and let you put a connection into URLs for the purpose of getting cryptographic material. And so I could take Bitcoin, I could take Ethereum, I could take Polkadot or Cosmos, I could take, frankly, a centralized service
Yeah.
and extract a URL that a resolver knows how to interpret to go get the data from it. So in some way, DIDs are one way, maybe not the only way, but one way that you can connect the World Wide Web to Web3. Like you've got
So
all these disparate systems that are decentralized. Well, we now have at least one mechanism where I can get back a consistent identifier structured in a particular way. Like
yep.
your credit card that fits into your wallet, right?
Mhm.
I can use that in any system that is willing to defer the role of identifier to someone else. And there are
Yeah,
lots of people who want to do
that's
that. Log in with
federation.
Facebook, right?
Right,
It is
exactly.
federation. So I don't want to deal with most people, most websites don't want to deal with username and password customer support problems.
Right.
And eventually we'll get to where, oh, that's just their wallet and they log in with their crypto and we don't have to
Yeah.
support that. Just like drive-through restaurants don't have to support your oil change,
Yeah. Makes sense.
right? Like let's separate those concerns is sort of what's happening with DIDs.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. And I'm a big proponent of the Web3 wallet as it did, just because it's so simple. It's already adopted everywhere. It is so huge. I mean, there's millions of these wallets out there that are being used. Like, I think like MetaMask right now is like 1.7 million active monthly users, or seven.
Mm.
No, can you look up how many active users using MetaMask right now? Yeah, I'm curious because I know I think it's way more than that. I think I'm way off. I think it's closer to like 17 million or something bizarre.
Yep.
But
Have you followed what's going on with the I think it's the digital credential work at the W3C?
no.
This is under the Web Incubator Community Group, the Y Community Group.
Okay.
Apple and Google have gotten together. This is the most important part of it, is that these two guys are trying to solve this problem, which is the MetaMask problem. And namely, we don't have a standard way to go from your browser to some
Mhm.
cryptographic, handler.
Mhm.
And so MetaMask is an insecure point for me as a user, because who are these guys? I don't know that I want to trust them. What's happening there? And there have been, of course, some attacks through MetaMask, which is
Sure.
inevitable with any piece of software. It's not because
Yep.
of MetaMask. But they're basically trying to solve this problem that I'm in a browser and I need to get to my secure enclave on my Android.
Yep.
And like they're the guys who can solve that problem. And I just want them to solve it. I mean, there are certain parameters around it. I hope they do it one way versus another way. But
Yeah.
once that's solved, then we don't have to rely on individual bespoke plugins that you individually load into your browser. Your browser will just do it natively. And
Just
I
like
think that's
Brave
going to be
has a Brave
beautiful.
wallet built in.
That's right. I've not used, I use Brave. I haven't used that wallet, but
I
maybe I
don't need
should
it.
give
I
it a
still
run.
use MetaMask.
Yeah, I use my Ledger Live, but
Yeah.
sometimes
So
I guess
it's
MetaMask
30
I do
million
for
users
NFTs.
for MetaMask right now.
What was the number?
30 million.
Oh yeah, that's a healthy
So
number.
like that I was talking with CEO, Andre from Ping and some
Hey,
of his
Andre Duran.
higher ups. Yep. And I was talking to him about, I was like, hey, how come you guys aren't supporting Web3 wallets and as an identifier? As you're the identity management company like this. And they're like, oh, we're not seeing enough adoption yet to warrant it. And I was like, well, what do you consider a good, like healthy adoption rate? He's like, well, at least like 100,000 users. I'm like, okay, so what you're saying is you guys don't know the market because it's like
That's right.
we've been past 100,000 for a long time now, and it's man, I don't know. I love it. We actually have a system that we built out. We haven't released it yet. We're still kind of tweaking it. We're going to show it off at Identiverse a little bit, but where you can just use your Web3 wallet, whether it's MetaMask or Phantom or your Ledger, whatever you have, and that is your corporate GID. So now it ties into traditional federation. So you can tie to Ping
Very
Feder,
cool.
you can tie it to an orchestrator, you can tie it to Okta, all of it. But now you can get rid of using as a password and you can just use whatever, bring your own wallet, right? Whatever you want to use.
Yep.
And it natively just goes right in, ties to OIDC, SAML, OAuth, all that fun stuff. So
Oh, I'm excited. Well, I'll be looking for that. I won't be at
yeah,
Identiverse, but
no, you're going to be at EIC.
yeah, we'll see you in June for sure.
Yes, I'll be out there.
Cool.
Cool, man. Well, one last thing. I want to know from your standpoint, if you could give me and the viewers a concise definition of decentralized identity and verifiable credential.
You want identity or identifier? Do you want the
Uh,
spec or do you want the
no, I don't want
concept?
the spec. I want the concept. I want you to tell the CIO of Big Corp Bank, this is what a decentralized identity is when they're referring to it, and this is
Yep.
what a verifiable credential is when they'd be referring to it.
Sure. So a decentralized identity is uh, it's a collection of technologies that lets individuals use cryptography to anchor their interactions in a trustable, verifiable way with arbitrary third parties. So like log in with Facebook without Facebook, I can reliably perform authentication actions because I have a cryptographic data store that I can do proof of control and those sorts of mechanisms, so that the company who's relying on it can rely on the math rather than rely on the institution of Facebook.
And verifiable credential?
Verifiable credentials are signed statements by specific knowable authors about some subject, and that's all they are. Often we treat VCs, or some people want to use VCs for like capabilities, like to trigger activities or for authorizations. And because you can say anything in a verifiable credential, you could, of course, construct a semantic notion of an authorization framework. But the VC in that case is just acting like a letter that has a secret code in it, or says, hey, please let my wife get this money out of my account, right? But if I just write on a piece of paper exactly that statement, that's not on check, it's not in the standard format, it's not signed in the normal way, the bank will get that piece of information, say, we don't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
But you could make that statement in a VC. But the most useful thing about VCs is that they make statements with an explicit author. There is not you cannot say in a VC something as abstract as the sky is blue. What you are necessarily saying is Joe says the sky is blue, because it's signed by a specific author.
Right.
And so we get rid of this abstract or objective narrator, because facts they don't exist that way. We wish they would, and we would like to be able to count on the sky being blue. But it's interesting, once you say that Joe says the sky is blue, then you start thinking, oh, well, when did he say it? And where is he?
And who's
like,
Joe?
It invokes a whole and who's Joe? Like, it invokes a whole bunch of interesting questions that teach you more about what that statement is than if you just absorb it as a fact.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is not a fact in most places. Like, it's overcast right now. And so the statement can exist independent of its factuality, right? So
yes.
When you recognize that VCs are statements, I think it's a much easier way to think about where you might use them. So anywhere you have a credential, like a driver's license, that's effectively a statement from one entity saying, hey, this subject has certain privileges. They're allowed to drive a commercial vehicle or a motorcycle or whatever. And that's just a statement. So I think VCs are digital statements made by knowable entities and cryptographically verifiable, with a mechanism for revocation that doesn't require phoning home to the issuer.
Nice. And then my last question would be, what would be the 3 top persuasive arguments as to why a company should start looking about moving towards decentralized ID rather than centralized authentication repositories?
Wow. So I think the number one reason is you probably don't need or want some other entity between you and your customer. So one of the problems that has occurred in this identity world in the last couple of years was there was a service, I think it was ID.me, that the IRS had blessed as being where everyone would have to biometrically authenticate to interact with the IRS. And it looked like it was happening. It was announced that this is what was going to happen. And there was a huge uproar, because I don't need any commercial entity between me and my government.
Right.
It's just not appropriate. And so I think that would be the number one, is that you don't need some other entity between you and your customer. You want the most honest and authentic mechanism to be able to make sure you're dealing with what they really want, and not what Facebook is happening to let you see today. So that would be the first one, is this notion of you want an intimate relationship with your parties, but you don't need to manage all that stuff yourself, the username and password. Like, you can get rid of that. The second thing would be to increase enhanced verifiability of information that your business depends on. So right now, some businesses depend on you scanning your driver's license and sending it in. If we were using a digital verifiable credential as a driver's license, such as is now available in California, I don't know if you follow that news from the California DMV. Now you have a cryptographic way to verify that it's actually related to that person. And we have an incredible number of fake IDs in circulation. And if we just switch them to digital VCs that were signed by appropriate authorities like California DMV, then a VC that was made, in India or China, which is where current driver's license, physical driver's license are today made. If you want a fake driver's license, you can get it shipped to your home. You give them the
Oh,
information to
easily.
put on it, and
Yeah.
you get a perfect California driver's license in your home. And that can't happen if we have known signed authorities, and you know that California DMV signs with this public key. Now I can verify to a cryptographic level of assurance that in fact this is a legitimate driver's license. So if you care about that kind of verifiability, VCs are really useful for that. You wanted 3.
What about a risk? Anything along risk?
Oh yes, I will anchor what I think is the maybe the most interesting part of identifiers and AI.
Mm,
So, because I've been involved in this user-centric identity thing 15 plus years, how AI, specifically really it's LLMs, like the
right.
fact that they got to call themselves AI was a brilliant marketing coup. Like it solves one piece of the stack, in the whole AGI thing. But they did make it happen in terms of consumers thinking, oh, this might be AI. But how identifiers did in particular, and VCs can help with AI, is this cascade collapse problem, which I don't know if you've heard about. I've heard numbers
Mm,
as small as 7%. If 7% of the money of the data that's ingested by an LLM, it collapses. If it's from an LLM, like part of the challenge is, and it's happening right now with ChatGPT, where people are building websites like SEO-based websites that are essentially content free, except they've got a bunch of SEO buzzwords, and they use something like ChatGPT to organize it to look like a website about diarrhea or a website about fast cars or a website about whatever. And so search engines and ChatGPT are now ingesting websites made by ChatGPT. And so it gets a dilution of the source material, and in a relative, like I think it's 2 or 3 generations or 7%, like depending on who's doing the study or who's thinking about it, this collapse happens really quickly. And it is one of the reasons that Sam Altman started WorldCoin, which was who created the orb, the retina scanning device to try and give you a single cryptographic coin to one person at a time. Like everyone on the planet would get one WorldCoin was their idea. And the reason they wanted that is, one, they wanted to be able to sort of buy off the public, right? They proposed 2% of their gross revenue be paid as a UBI, and using this orb to distribute it fairly. But that's sort of a marketing sort of story. I think the real reason they need it is because if they can't detect the AI content, then ChatGPT itself stops working. So I think part of the dance of how identifiers help AI is if we can know for a fact that a piece of content was authored by an individual, and by know for a fact, I mean that a human individual is claiming that they wrote it.
right.
I can't actually know that they wrote it. They maybe used a typewriter or they used an AI. But if some entity has said, this is me as an entity, I'm legally responsible for this content,
Yeah.
then now we can start to differentiate, oh, this AI didn't have a known legal entity associated, but this content did.
Well, then
Now
shouldn't that
I
be
can
kind of
pull
like
that
where
information in.
Google rank kind of isn't what they tried to solve with that was really saying like, well, what's the validity or the trust in the site as to how legit the content is and back then it was based on how many sites linked to it. And as soon as we figured that out, we was, oh, we'll just make a bunch of sites that link to it and boost up the page rank.
That's
But
right.
like, isn't that kind of what AI would be doing? Is sort even if it was legit written by a person, like let's say I spin up a website and I write it out by hand and I sign it with my cryptographic key, and there it is, but it's one page on one site. Like, how much trust should you really take in that versus the New York Times? I don't know if you should trust that now, but you know what I'm saying.
Well, the New York Times is a great example, actually. In fact, because of this political bias that you sort of joke about, when we know the author, we can take political bias into consideration.
Right.
When it's treated as a fact, that is very, very hard to tease out. Like,
Yeah.
you know, literally, like really deep ideas like colonialism get baked into how we think about things, and if
Right.
we can't extract from that, we just reify that. Um, this to me, there was a conversation at IAW about proof of personhood. And whether it's proof of humanity or proof of unique personhood, those are slightly different, right? One is just to show you've got a pulse, another is that you're unique within a body politic. And people were discussing this idea, well, could I have a credential that's like a KYC VC or a VC that says I'm human? And I'm like, well, you can, but I can give that to my code. I can have my software agent present my VC if I'm compliant, right? If I'm complicit, I can totally get around that. So I think the best you can do is tie the content to who's legally liable for it. So now if I see some AI and I know that it's signed by Joe Andrew, then well, Joe Andrew is on the hook for whether that's true or false or inducing some problem or whatnot. And that mechanism now lets us, I think, connect the actions of AI to the rule of law.
That sounds scary.
Well, who's
Because now we
liable?
have, because a lot
When
of
your
times,
AI
I mean,
crashes your car, who's liable?
no, that I agree with. If we have, that's a whole different, what I'm thinking though is words being liable. Like that to me is a slippery slope because like I was saying before, like I come from the old school, like underground, I used to run by a handle. I would never publish anything under my name. I never did anything under my name. But I build up an identity under these handles where therefore if I released a white paper written by this person, it was taken as legit because I had a history amongst the industry, right? So now it's like I have a completely fake persona putting out legitimate content. But how do you validate that and tie it back to a person that doesn't want to be known?
Well, so I would argue that you don't need to tie it back to a person. So
Okay.
the notion of tying it back to the person is one of those 5 mental models that we found in the how we think about identity. Like if we need to punish the person because they've
Yeah.
committed crimes, right? This is the classic security mental model of time space. Then yes, we need to go find the like for some notion.
Right.
But in a free society, we don't let cops wander through houses without warrants.
Yeah.
To find the bad guys. Like we have structures and due process and whatnot. So I lost my thread.
So how do we have how do we protect people's anonymity with real data? Because I don't like how could you tell it was a bot and not a fake person? Because I don't want to attach my identity, me as Adam. I don't want my
Yep.
face, my retinas, my fingerprints, my biometrics, anything tied to it. So I want to make a decentralized app, let's say, and it's going to do something. I'm going to write some paper about, hey, here's a new way. Perfect example, Satoshi Nakamoto, right? He released a white paper that's 9 pages long, 8 really, 1 page of citations. It's transformative in the world of finance and decentralized modeling. No one knows who Satoshi Nakamoto is still to this day. But
That's right.
we all 100% trust that Satoshi Nakamoto that made those certain forum posts and wrote this paper and did the thing are all the same entity. And we 100% believe everything in that paper. But it's been validated because of blockchain. It's been validated because of Bitcoin over time. So how do I say when the next Satoshi comes out, and let's say Satoshi Nakamoto writes another white paper tomorrow and puts it out, how do we know that it's him? Because he didn't sign it with the public key at the time, I don't believe.
Well, he could today.
Now he could for sure.
We do have Bitcoin transactions, which we believe were from Satoshi. By canon, you have to accept that he sent the first one to Hal Finney, right? So
right, that's
if
kind of
someone
where we
could
start.
prove that they had the private key related to that first transaction or any other one that we believe is Satoshi, then I could do a cryptographic challenge. And I think that supports sort of one area of solution space is pseudonyms, right? You had a pseudonym, it wasn't a cryptographic one, but part of the notion of DIDs that a lot of people usually it's in their first year of thinking about DIDs, where they think a person has a DID, right? That it's a singular identifier. But really, the way these systems work, you're going to spin up a DID anywhere you need one. So in effect, you can have really robust pseudonymous engagement. That in fact you can have revealable pseudonymity. In the way that you can commit to a thing and then not have it be verifiable until later you reveal the private key, right? Just like The
Sure.
Bitcoin address is hashed. You don't know the public key associated with it, but you can verify that when a public key is presented in a transaction, that
Yeah.
it must have been the public key that secured that.
Right.
Right. So that ability to have pseudonyms through cryptography, I think, addresses a huge part of your use case. There is another idea I want to vet. I haven't really shared this broadcast context yet, but I think there is a role for digital fiduciaries in dealing with the deeply personal information that we sometimes need to establish identity. And a fiduciary is like a doctor or a lawyer or a CPA. These are common fiduciaries that most of us have had some experience with. Fiduciaries have a responsibility to the principal to put their interest in a particular domain above their own. So a doctor cannot use my medical information for their own benefit.
Right.
An accountant can't use my financial information for their own benefit. Like, this is the fundamental solution to the fact that we must trust people in domains we don't have the experience or expertise to make the decision in. And I think identity has become one of those places. And there are a lot, like, I will not give my DNA to 23andMe.
No.
Because I don't trust it. And part of
Yeah.
why I don't trust it is because they could be acquired. Like, even if everyone there is a saint,
Right.
like, they could run into a rough patch, they go into bankruptcy, and now someone I know is a bad actor with that data has the legal right to do whatever they want with that data.
Well, that happened with I've never gone through the micromillimeter scanners in the airports, the big do
Oh,
this move. I've never
uh-huh.
been through one once in my life. And I've always said, nope, you're out of your mind, never doing it. And then the first company that was running those things, I forget if it was that they were going under or whatever, but they wound up selling all their data, all the imagery and everything they had to third party, one of them being the Russian government. So it's like instantly all that biometric information is just now in the wild. I'm like, oh, well, glad I'm not part of that.
Yep.
And it's like,
So
that's always my biggest fear.
I think the way we can get around that is with these, what I'm calling digital fiduciaries. And I've been percolating this idea now for a couple of years. And hopefully by the next IIW in the fall, we're going to have a more coherent sort of rollout. Because it's just languaging. Like, you want to speak about it in a way that's accurate, doesn't confuse people.
Yeah.
But the idea of this digital fiduciary is that you could have this fiduciary provider who is checking my credentials like the DMV does when you go in to get a
So they're
driver's
like
license.
a CA, a certificate authority of some kind.
That's right. And they are, for example, they could use exactly the USCS I-9 protocol, which is how I prove eligibility to work in the US. And there's some rules about, I can have just a passport satisfies it, or I could have a driver's
List
license
A
and a
B
social security
combo.
card. Right. It's the A or B and
B and C
C.
combo.
So that protocol, I could go to a firm that has a fiduciary relationship with all the data I give them. So they're agreeing to, if I use my passport, they are not going to use that for anything but for doing the service. And then they could fill out that form and sign it, right? Let's make it digital. So we'll make it a VC and whatnot. And then they could store all the evidence of that in an offline manner so that they could be audited.
Yeah.
And if we then take the attestation that they generate and record it in some sort of timestamp mechanism, like you could post a hash to block to Bitcoin, then you could actually have both visibility and auditability into this system. And I think with that architecture, where I'm trusting my own personally chosen digital fiduciary, and because of the audits, the company can trust it because you will have a record of how many times these organizations have issued attestations, how many times it's been audited, how many times they've been wrong. Hopefully it's never, but there's some framework there. And I think that starts to connect how at least in America we deal with these fiduciaries of doctors and lawyers, these self-regulating professional classes, to help us deal with this private information we really don't want out there about my private life.
So wouldn't that put those fiduciaries body entities under kind of like a hyper attack mode? Like, that would be something everyone would be trying to attack to get in if there was this one centralized location of everyone's passport information or I-9 variability information. Correct.
A key part of this, I love that you brought that up. Dave Longley also had a similar response. I don't know if you know Dave, but we don't want to create a new architecture of honeypots.
Right.
But right now, the information in my doctor's office is just in his office. Like, the actual honeypot problem isn't my doctor, it's the insurance network. right? So Blue Shield, Blue Cross, they're a huge honeypot of insane amount of customer
Big time,
data.
of
My
course.
doctor who works down the street, like, he's actually the only
Yeah,
doctor in
I'm
his office.
I'm not worried about like China breaching my local dentist.
Yeah, exactly. So part of the architecture is to figure out a way so that these fiduciaries are small and that that professionals are personally liable for
Mm.
the actions of that fiduciary, which
So,
is which is
because
how
like
law firms work. Like you
you know
can't
my
escape that liability.
MITRE, right? That does the CVEs and everything.
Yes.
Okay, so they just got breached by China.
Uh,
Um, it just came out. Yeah, they apparently they were breached on December 31st. I guarantee you New Year's Eve because no one's paying attention, right? And they were in their systems for almost 4 months before they realized that they'd been breached. China had a new
wow.
0 day on their VPN, got in, and then has just been siphoning and trying to, scale around their network. So right, that's why I was asking that question because I was literally just talking about this, and because that's one of those things where they have all the CVEs of unreleased CVEs, right? So like they've been reported, but they're actively patching. So they don't
Hmm.
want the world to know what's going on yet. But well, now imagine you have access to that. You have a
Yeah.
treasure trove of 0 days of everything. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So that's where my concern is like, and that's a big, there's a 100% security minded company focus, but it's a 0 day in a VPN. It's not, they're not the VPN company, and
Yep.
that happens. So,
Well, no,
and then
no
they just
system
found
can be
credentials.
secure, right?
Yeah, I hate it when people say it's like our stuff's unhackable. It's like, well, I can't talk to you anymore. It's like,
Yep.
so that's my concern. And that's why I really like the idea of zero knowledge proofs. I know they're a lot more
Uh-huh.
complicated and a lot harder, even just to understand. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how I've played with it enough to where I've done it, but even then there's a level where I get down in the stack where I'm like, and then magic, because I just
Yep.
don't understand the math. But I think to me, I feel like that's the direction to solve that problem, which is these fiduciary places, those fiduciary authorities, let's say, have a zero knowledge proof setup of the real data. So they don't actually contain my passport number and my photo and everything else. But what they have is almost like a cryptographic hash that proves out certain pieces of the info. So if we're ever verified, you can say, yeah, it is. Even I don't know what the actual passport number is, but I can tell you that he has a passport, it's legit and it's not expired. So like
Yep.
the example I like the most is going to the bar. If I'm going to go to the bar, bartender says, "Hey, I need your ID." Right now, you hand him your ID, and it's like I'm not worried about it. But let's say I'm a 21-year-old girl in New York City, and there's some sketchy barman or bouncer, like whoever's working the
But
door.
you like sketchy barmen.
I do. That's the places I like to hang out at, actually. That's why I can tie to this so well. So it's like, these girls are giving all their ID. What's on there? It's their address, where they
Yeah.
live, their apartment
Yeah.
number, their age, their weight, all the things that girls don't want people to know. And it's all on this. And we have laws around protecting people from having to give that information when not needed. All the bar needs to know is this person over 21?
Yep.
And so that's where I think like this whole zero knowledge proof of this fiduciary authority system could take place, where it's like, look, I'm proving to you I'm over 21. Everything else is irrelevant. Like, I,
That's all. So let me applaud that direction. There is because we do want to get to where it is the absolute minimum amount of data.
yeah,
One of the challenges with the age over 21 has actually been a bit of canon that I've done some work to remove from the canon because it's so easy to explain. But the problem is when that bouncer looks at your driver's license, they
yeah,
are not just making sure that the orientation of the photo or the date indicates that you're of age. They're also looking at your photo and the photo on the driver's license and maybe
right.
some of the other data, like if it says you're a 60-year-old black man and you're obviously not, they might use that information,
Yes,
right? That's the McLovin
yes.
reference from Superbad. um, and so you do really, I think, need, especially in a digital context, well, actually that complicates things. I just introduced a whole new conversation, but you need that biometric in the
Right.
credential,
Yeah, I agree with you, but
not
that's
just that
simple.
you're over 21, but that you, the person in front of me, I have a reason to believe that this is your credential.
So I'm the bouncer. Here, I'm gonna use my phone thing. So I'm the bouncer with my little phony thing to scan your ID, which they all have now anyway for scanning or taking pictures, whatever. Now
Yep.
I show up and I'm like, I'm coming in. I want to have a drink. This is gonna be delicious. And then the bouncer's like, sweet, I need to see your ID. I scan my face for a biometric doing a live scan. Then when I tap my phone or I'm nearby, I scan the QR code, whatever it is, I receive a nonce from them. I sign that nonce with and it's been biometrically allowed. So that's then signed. My zero knowledge proof of I'm over 21 is then passed back. They can prove it was the wallet. It's got because they have the nonce, they have the public key of my wallet, and they says I'm over 21. Yay, I can let you in.
Yes. The challenge with, so I've been involved with Digital Bazaar's rollout of the True Age project.
Mhm.
Are you familiar with that? That's the
No.
National Association of Convenience Stores has rolled out a service for their members who they age check about 60 million Americans on
Yeah.
a given day, right? It's all the convenience stores out there. And so they rolled out this service that's free to them if they're members in the association to do digital age verification
Okay.
and systemic limits, which is another interesting wrinkle. But at the core of it, it is sort of this architecture that you're talking about, that we're just getting a token back that says you're of age,
Yeah.
and it didn't have to reveal any other data. So there
Right.
is a point at which we bootstrap from the driver's license, and we have an in-person biometric check where a cashier takes the license and will note, yeah, I checked it once, like this person did at least once, look like the person in the thing.
Okay.
Because in the entire digital, if it were entirely digital, you couldn't know for sure. So we have this loop where we do check with a human being.
Couldn't you? Because the photo is stored and like a passport. Like when I do a passport verification, get a picture of the photo that they have on the passport's system that matches the one on the actual passport. I have
Yes.
that. I do a biometric facial compare, unless they're an identical twin, but in which
Yep.
case they're still over 21.
Yep. So now you're not decentralized anymore, and you've got a phone home problem because you're checking with the centralized database. And by the way, the
Only
federal
one
government
time.
will not give you access to those biometrics.
No, not they won't give me access to biometrics. They'll give me the picture of the person.
Are
That I
you
get all
sure?
the time. Yeah, I get that now. When I validate my employees, when I do background checks, I get their picture of their passport right
Oh,
delivered to me. Like
interesting.
because
I didn't know they would share that information.
it says, hey, is this the picture you see on their passport? And it's like it's
Huh.
verifying it. So I'm like, yeah, that's pretty rad. So
Yep.
so it's giving me the picture. So I have the picture, and I only have to do that to set up the verifiable credential. Because once I've say, okay, I'm gonna do my biometric, and then
Yep.
I go to the U.S. Passport Agency. It takes the picture received. If that biometric meets the one of the live scan that I just did, okay, that's the same person. Now
Yep.
trust that verifiable credential, sign it, and store it. So now when I do my going to the bar, that biometric tied to the passport's already been validated at that point.
Yes, but you could have given your phone to someone else. Like
I could have
there is
given
the
my
loop in
phone.
which if you were complicit, there are all sorts of attacks available.
Oh, sure. There would have to be someone could definitely have my phone. Okay, I can see that. They'd have to be. I guess that's
I
when it
mean,
kind of has a timer. Like if it has to be done within like 30
yeah,
seconds or
yeah.
something.
The societal problem is the kid brother, whose older brother is complicit.
Okay.
Like that is one of the that is such a hard gap to fill in our social agenda around underage drinking. Um,
Well, wouldn't it just
so
be a timing perspective? Like, hey, I had a live scan within the last 30 seconds, therefore it
yes,
matches.
no, that is one of the best defenses. I think the biggest challenge with the live scan is I think those are on the other side of the AI bubble.
Okay.
Like we are seeing synthetic identities of people presenting a fake driver's license to do, KYC, AML, and it's all digitally synthetic. So I think we're losing the arms race against those types of automatic detection. But what we can do is we can anchor to your cryptography. So like the idea, one of the aspects of this digital fiduciary notion is what you're doing when you go into one of these fiduciary providers is binding a cryptographic identifier to their ceremony of having checked your identity with
Mm,
whatever protocol
right.
they are doing it for. Like if they're using USCSI 9, they use a different rule than, if you're using Real ID in California. Like those are two different standards
Yeah.
of identity assurance. But you could use either one, and then you get a VC issued from that entity, and it's tied to your DID.
Mm.
So now you have a link that you got from some trustable authority where you can now do cryptographic operations and have some sense that, hey, a month ago or 2 months ago, I had done this ceremony to prove that this is who I am. And depending on the requirement, maybe you had to go do that last week. Maybe you had to go do it within the last year. Like those are all policy decisions that we can be flexible
Right.
on if the architecture is right.
Yeah. Yeah, because I was
So,
trying to figure out that problem of the timing thing because like whenever you do a live scan, it takes a long time to do a live scan versus Face ID unlock on your phone. By a long time, I mean seconds versus sub-second, right? And but that seconds adds up when you're signing into a computer, trying to walk into a building, trying to do something. You're sitting there like, give me a second.
yep,
Okay, it's like
yep.
that's annoying.
While
But
while 5 other things are happening,
yeah.
right? Yeah, it's a challenging problem. I think mostly we just don't know how to build our institutions that use this technology because we built our institutions with a different generation's worth of technology. And
Yeah.
it's trying to figure out what was really important about those institutions versus what did we do because the technology made it easy.
Yep. Yeah.
And I think that's the work you and I are engaged in. Like all of us
Yeah.
who care about this movement are like, oh, I see a piece of it that I could maybe help clarify in advance.
Yep.
It's an exciting place to be. Like when I was younger, I used to think, man, wouldn't it be great to have lived in the Wild West and like that would have been fun. And I'm like, dude, this is a wild time to be alive. Like
Oh yeah,
there's
especially
crazy
now
stuff going
with
on.
AI, it's over. It's gonna be so crazy to see what happens.
Yep, AI, nanotech,
Yeah.
it's amazing what this century is going to do for us or to
Yeah.
us. Who knows which way it'll end up.
Yeah, right. Inadvertently. Whoops. Cool. Well, hey, I know I've taken up way more of your time than we originally planned. This was an awesome conversation, though,
Yeah,
and I
have
look
fun.
forward to meeting you in Berlin at
Indeed,
EIC.
I will. I'll look forward to it. What panel are you on, or what's your?
I am not on a panel. I'm going to
Oh,
be
okay.
there, actually, just kind of covering it for the podcast. I'm working with the guys and girls, I should say, putting on the show to help try to just do like live coverage as to what's going on. I've never been out there. I've been to
Oh,
Berlin a
cool.
lot. I've never been to the conference, and I really am using this as an excuse because I have a lot of friends in Berlin. It's one of my favorite places to go. So,
Nice.
oh darn, I have to go for work now.
Well, it's a great experience. I'm glad you reached out to me because I happen to be going to EIC. This is a great conversation.
Yeah, this has been awesome. Thank you, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks. Oh,
All
see you
right,
in
take care,
Berlin.
Adam. Bye.
Bye. Hey everyone, you going to Identifiers this year, May 28th and 29th in Las Vegas? We're going to be there and we're going to make it awesome. How? We're having a scavenger hunt where you can win awesome prizes, hats, cool bottle opener, butterfly knives, awesome whiskey stones that are all custom branded, leather posters, United Yetis, custom Viking mugs, a real weapon, custom Raven hatchet, 1,000 years old, real Viking keys, and this awesome weapon. And cool fun stuff like an invite to our private party. The way that you're going to find it is find these little poker chips all over the convention, tap your phone to them, and that's how you're going to start the scavenger hunt. Lots of cool prizes, and not everyone's going to be able to make it. Hope you can do it. I'll see you guys there. Later.